What did the Japanese pilots truly feel in those final months of the war, when the distant hum over Tokyo grew into the unmistakable roar of America's P-51 Mustangs? How did a nation that once dominated the skies of East Asia find itself suddenly outmatched by sleek, long-range fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere? And why were these Mustangs arriving in great shimmering formations from the far horizon so shocking, so demoralizing, and ultimately so decisive in the air war over the Japanese homeland? These are the questions that pull us back into the winter and spring of 1945, into a city already scarred by years of conflict, where the sky itself had become a battlefield, and where every approaching engine carried the weight of dread. In those months, Tokyo was a city living in the shadow of its own unraveling. The fires of previous raids still smoldered in the memories of civilians. Shortages of fuel, food, and hope gnawed at the edges of everyday life. Yet it was in the air that the war's final phase took its most dramatic turn, a transformation shaped by American engineering, shifting strategy, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of industrial capacity. For Japanese fighter pilots, many barely 20 years old, the sudden appearance of the P-51 Mustang was not just a tactical shock, but a grim symbol, a sign that the war had passed a point of no return. And as their stories reveal, this shock was not only technological but deeply human, a collision of desperation and determination in a sky lit by contrails and burning engines. The story begins long before the Mustangs reached Japan. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, where for years the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces had defined the tempo of aerial warfare, early in the war, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was the terror of Allied pilots. Its maneuverability unmatched, its range astonishing. But the brilliance of the Zero carried within it a fatal flaw. Japan failed to modernize fast enough. Engineers struggled to reinforce its airframe or add armor without ruining the very qualities that made it formidable. By 1944, American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair were not just matching the Zero, they were surpassing it in speed, firepower, and survivability. The Japanese pilots watching this shift sensed the storm coming. But none could predict how overwhelming that storm would become once the Mustang entered the Pacific theater. It was a shift that unfolded like a darkening horizon, slow but undeniable. The turning point came with strategy just as much as machinery. By late 1944, the U.S. had captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, transforming them into massive forward operating bases for the new B-29 Super Fortress. Those airfields, built with staggering speed by CBs under tropical heat, were designed for a single purpose: to bring Japan within reach of sustained strategic bombing. The B-29 was unlike anything Japan had faced: high-flying, fast, and capable of carrying enormous bomb loads over thousands of miles. But even the B-29 had vulnerabilities. Early raids over Japan suffered from mechanical issues, inconsistent weather data, and most critically, a lack of adequate escort fighters. That weakness gave Japanese pilots one last moment of advantage, diving from altitude onto the powerful but exposed superfortresses, scoring hits that reverberated across American command rooms. Yet behind those frustrations, Air Force planners were already preparing a solution, one that would erase that last Japanese advantage entirely. That solution was the P-51 Mustang, a fighter that had started as a British request, evolved through countless design refinements, and reached perfection only when paired with the Rolls-Royce-derived Packard-built Merlin engine. This transformation felt almost miraculous. Suddenly the Mustang could fly farther, climb faster, and fight harder than nearly any aircraft in the world. It was a machine built for high altitude, built for speed, built to escort, and built for endurance. All it needed was a base close enough to Japan for its extraordinary range to matter. With the capture of Iwo Jima in early 1945, that final piece fell into place. The cost of Iwo was horrific, Marines clawing their way across black sands under ceaseless fire, but its strategic value to the air campaign was beyond question. The moment the runways on Motoyama were serviceable, American ground crews deployed Mustangs to the island. And almost overnight, the air over Japan changed. When the first P-51s rose from Iwo Jima and set course toward the Japanese mainland, many pilots were struck by the surreal distance they had to cross. Hours of open waters stretched beneath them, a silent, glittering expanse broken only by occasional cloud banks. The Mustang's range made the journey possible, but not comfortable. One mechanical failure, one navigational error, one sudden patch of bad weather, and the Pacific would claim another aircraft. Yet for the pilots who reached the Japanese coast, the moment of approach was unforgettable. They saw a landscape rarely glimpsed by Americans: fishing villages clinging to shorelines, mountain ridges rising like great dark spines, and beyond them the rising haze of Tokyo itself. What awaited them there was not just combat, but the unraveling of Japan's final aerial defense. For Japanese fighter units, by early 1945 the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. Fuel reserves were critically low, training hours had been slashed, replacement parts were scarce. Many pilots were rushed through abbreviated courses, given minimal flight time, and ordered to defend their homeland against some of the best aviators in the world. Their aircraft Ki-43 Oscars, Ki-61 Tonys, KD for Franks, each had strengths, but none were available in sufficient numbers, and all suffered from the choking grip of wartime shortages. The most advanced fighters were limited by unreliable engines or poor fuel quality. Ground controllers, struggling with damaged radar and communication networks, often couldn't vector pilots in time. Against this backdrop, when Japanese pilots first saw the P-51s overhead, sleek, silver and flying in tight disciplined formations, many described the moment as a shock that chilled them more deeply than the cold slipstream outside their canopies. It was like watching the future arrive all at once. The early engagements over Tokyo were violent bursts of motion in a sky already crowded with B-29 contrails. Japanese pilots, fighting with courage that historians still note with respect, attempted head-on attacks or vertical dives, tactics refined through years of earlier combat. But the Mustangs had the speed to meet them, the climb rates to intercept them, and the firepower to shatter their formations. American pilots, trained through the rigorous system developed by the Army Air Forces, executed coordinated tactics with lethal precision. Some Japanese records describe the frustration of attempting to maneuver for advantage, only to find a Mustang already on their tail, its nose steady, its guns flashing. Others recall the eerie silence after battle, the sky suddenly emptied, save for the droning of American escorts guiding the B-29s home. For many Japanese aviators, these encounters were the moment they realized the war in the air was lost, even if no one dared speak it aloud. As the P-51s increased their presence, the psychological impact on civilians became unavoidable. Tokyo residents began to distinguish the deep thunder of B-29 engines from the higher, sharper note of the Mustang. People looked up and saw agile fighters weaving around the bombers, their wings catching the sun like metal blades. Some accounts describe how the Mustangs flew so low during strafing or reconnaissance runs that witnesses could see the glint of a pilot's helmet or read the insignia on the fuselage. This proximity, this unmistakable sense of vulnerability, contributed to a growing realization that the last shield of the homeland had been pierced. The air war was no longer distant. It had arrived directly above the capital. Tactically, the Mustangs played a role far more complex than simple escort duty. They could sweep ahead of bomber streams, clearing the sky before the B-29s arrived. They could patrol airfields, catching Japanese fighters as they attempted to take off, engines sputtering on octane fuel. They could strafe transportation networks that were already strained under the pressures of war. And they could provide rescue support for downed B-29 crews, orbiting crash sites or chasing off attackers. It was an all-encompassing dominance that compressed the Japanese defensive window until it nearly vanished. Pilots on the ground, hearing the alarms and rushing to their aircraft, often found Mustangs overhead before they had even reached full throttle. Years later, surviving Japanese aviators spoke of this era with a mixture of awe and sorrow, a time when skill and bravery were not enough to overcome the vast technological and industrial tide rising against them. Some historians debate the exact scale of the Mustang's impact compared to the devastating firebombing raids that followed, but all agree that by controlling the air above Japan, the P-51s made those raids possible. On the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, when Operation Meeting House unleashed an inferno over Tokyo that killed tens of thousands, Mustangs patrolled the skies to catch any Japanese fighter attempting to rise through the choking smoke. And in the months that followed, as raids spread to Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe, the Mustang's presence became an almost daily reminder of America's reach. For the Japanese High Command, the situation was untenable. They had no reliable way to challenge the escorts, no means to replace losses, no fuel to train new pilots. Yet they continued the struggle, driven by duty, honor, and a desperate hope for some shift in fortune that might change the war's direction. As summer approached, scarcity turned to crisis. Many Japanese pilots took off knowing they might not return, not because of tactical defeat, but because their engines might fail, their fuel tanks might run dry, or the overwhelming American presence might make escape impossible. Kamikaze units, formed earlier in the Philippines, expanded as a response to the overwhelming Allied advantage, but even these desperate tactics failed to halt the Mustangs. The P-51s intercepted many kamikaze formations before they reached naval targets, breaking them apart with disciplined aggression. Those who survived the war later described the grief of watching their comrades fall one by one, caught in a vice of dwindling supplies and relentless American pressure. And still, they flew. Still, they climbed into the sky each morning, scanning for the silhouettes they had come to dread. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Mustang had already reshaped the battlefield over Japan. The air defense network was fractured, the fighter force decimated, and the morale of surviving pilots strained to its limit. When Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender on August 15, 1945, many airmen felt a complicated mixture of relief, grief, and disbelief. They had fought with immense courage against impossible odds, and now the silence that followed the war felt as heavy as the smoke that once hung over Tokyo. For American pilots, the end brought its own reflections. The men who had flown the Mustang from Iwo Jima knew the risks they had taken, the comrades they had lost, and the strange intimacy of battling an enemy who fought so fiercely in defense of their homeland. They returned home carrying memories of long flights over the Pacific, narrow escapes, and the haunting beauty of a sunrise scene from the cockpit after a night of combat. Looking back, historians often point to the P-51 Mustang as one of the defining aircraft of the Second World War, not only for its technical excellence, but for the way it shaped strategic decisions at the highest levels of command. The air war over Japan revealed the decisive power of range, endurance, and integrated strategy. It showed how industrial capacity could amplify innovation, how training systems could shape outcomes, and how air superiority could accelerate the collapse of a nation already weakened by years of attrition. For Japan, the arrival of the Mustangs was a stark message. The skies no longer belonged to them, and for the pilots who faced those silver wings, the experience left a deep imprint, a mixture of shock, respect, and the painful recognition that their world had changed forever. The story of the P-51s over Tokyo is not simply a tale of machines, but of the people who flew them and the people who watched them from below. It is a story of young Japanese aviators pushed into the sky with dwindling hope, of American pilots navigating long flights over hostile seas, and of civilians caught in the widening gyre of a war they could not escape. It is a reminder that technological superiority does not diminish the courage of those on the losing side, just as bravery does not erase the brutal realities of industrial warfare. Above all, it is a story about a moment when the world stood at the edge of transformation, when the roar of a Merlin engine over Tokyo signaled the beginning of the end of an era. The first months after Tokyo felt the touch of the Mustang were marked by a kind of shifting gravity, a slow but unmistakable tilting of the war toward its final descent. Yet the full weight of that shift would only become clear as winter gave way to spring, as the tempo of combat intensified, and as the survivors on both sides began to sense that the skies themselves were tightening around Japan. If Part 1 traced the moment of shock that first stunned recognition of American reach, then what followed was a deeper unraveling, one measured not in sudden revelations but in the relentless accumulation of daily losses, dwindling fuel, and exhausted men. The spring air over Tokyo grew thick with smoke and contrails, and every day carried its own harrowing stories. For Japanese pilots, the question was no longer whether they could turn back the tide, but how long they could endure before the tide swept them away entirely. In the cold mornings on airfields outside Tokyo, pilots would gather beside their aircraft while mechanics worked with frozen fingers, coaxing life into engines that had long surpassed their intended service hours. The KT-4 Frank, arguably Japan's best late-war fighter, still inspired confidence with its speed and climb rate, but even it suffered from unreliable engines and inconsistent fuel. Many pilots learned to read the subtle signs of mechanical fatigue the way one might read the cracks in a fatigued sky. A cough on startup, a hesitation in throttle response, the faint metallic rattle of overworked pistons. To take off in such machines demanded a certain resignation, a courage not rooted in victory or ideology but in simple, grim determination. Meanwhile, American squadrons on Iwo Jima were cycling through rigorous maintenance schedules, replacing engines, rotating parts, and preparing their Mustangs with a level of logistical support that must have seemed almost surreal to their Japanese counterparts. The contrast between the two air forces grew starker each week, like two tracks winding through the same storm but diverging ever farther as time passed. The long-range escort missions from Iwo Jima were feats of endurance that tested even seasoned American pilots. The Pacific could be cruelly deceptive, beautiful from above, deadly with even the smallest mistake. Hours spent in isolation over the open ocean brought a particular kind of fatigue, a mental erosion sharpened by the knowledge that one failure could end in silent disappearance. Pilots often described the sense of stepping into a world suspended between sea and sky, where the only stability came from the hum of the Merlin engine and the steady voice of the flight leader on the radio. Yet the true test awaited them when Japan's coastline rose into view. For many, the moment felt like crossing a threshold into another realm, a realm of smoke plumes, scattered anti-aircraft bursts, and the tense anticipation of enemy fighters rising to meet them. The Mustangs slipped into formation alongside the B-29s, each pilot scanning the altitudes where Japanese attackers might mass for a sudden strike. They flew into danger with discipline, each formation moving like a living machine, every pilot a vital component of a greater whole. On the Japanese side, the arrival of the Mustangs forced a painful evolution in tactics. Early attempts to engage the B-29s directly grew increasingly futile under the watchful presence of the escorts. The Americans had learned from earlier losses. Mustangs roamed ahead of the bombers, scouting for interceptors, while others circled above the formations, waiting to pounce on any fighter climbing to strike. Japanese pilots attempted hit-and-run attacks, diving out of the sun at high speed. But the Mustangs often countered with equal or greater speed, using their superior climb rate to match or overtake their adversaries. The Ki-61 Tony, with its inline engine and heavier armament, might have matched the P-51 in isolated encounters, but Japan simply had too few of them left, and their engines grew increasingly unreliable under wartime stress. Many Japanese veterans recalled the frustration of preparing perfectly timed attacks, only to have the escorts blitz through their formations with shocking precision. The sky became a place where initiative drifted steadily toward the Americans, leaving Japanese pilots feeling trapped in a shrinking arena. The toll on Japanese training systems was devastating. The once proud pipeline that had produced elite aviators in the early stages of the war had been hollowed out by casualties and strangled by fuel shortages. Trainees sometimes received fewer than a dozen hours of flying time before being sent into combat. Some could barely execute basic aerial maneuvers. When confronted with Mustangs flown by veterans hardened in Europe or the Pacific, many stood little chance. Surviving pilots spoke years later of seeing young comrades fall in their first engagements, their aircraft plummeting in flames or spinning helplessly into the sea. The grief of losing these inexperienced aviators gnawed at the veterans, shaping a sorrow that would linger long after the war ended. It wasn't merely defeat. It was the feeling of watching an entire generation thrown into a furnace they had no hope of escaping. Meanwhile, the Americans were experiencing their own form of strain, though of a different kind. The long missions over Japan placed immense pressure on Mustang pilots, who had to maintain peak vigilance for hours on end. Encounters with Japanese fighters could erupt suddenly, a flash of wings diving from above or streaking across the horizon. The adrenaline spike of combat was followed by long, quiet stretches of escort duty, where fatigue crept in like a slow tide. Some pilots admitted that the worst moments were not in the heat of dogfights, but in the hours after, when exhaustion pressed down and the monotony of the ocean return flight tested their nerves. The psychological toll of escort missions was subtle but real, a kind of frayed edge carried in silence. Yet they continued flying, mission after mission, knowing that every escort saved B-29 crews and tightened the noose around Japan's capacity to wage war. As the spring progressed and the firebombing raids grew more intense, the Mustangs played a role that went beyond protecting bombers. They became the eyes and claws of the air campaign. P-51s strafed airfields, trains, and military convoys. They destroyed warehouses and fuel depots. They even attacked shipping lingering near the coast. These attacks crippled Japan's ability to maneuver and resupply, exacerbating a collapse that had already begun. For Japanese defenders, the sight of low-flying Mustangs ripping across valleys and coastal plains added a new layer of dread. Civilians started to recognize the aircraft by their sound alone, a sharp, tearing engine note that sliced through the air before the fighters came screaming over rooftops. Many accounts described the surreal shock of seeing them so low that people instinctively ducked, even when the Mustangs had already passed. It was a new kind of war, one that blurred the line between front and home, leaving the entire landscape feeling exposed. The Japanese command struggled to adapt. Some insisted on conserving the remaining fighters for decisive engagements. Others pushed for aggressive intercepts regardless of cost. Neither approach stemmed the tide. Radar stations, long suffering from shortages and bomb damage, could not reliably track incoming formations. Many intercepts were launched too late or with too few aircraft. Even when Japanese pilots managed to break through the escort screen, the damage they inflicted rarely justified the losses. The air war had become a grim equation dominated by American logistics, training, and tactical coordination. Japan's defenders, courageous as they were, found themselves fighting not just against Mustangs but against the accumulated weight of years of attrition. For American pilots, encounters with Japanese fighters carried their own gravity. Some described the eerie beauty of seeing enemy aircraft glinting in the sun, their camouflaged wings merging with the landscape below. Others spoke of the sickening moments when they realized they had shot down very young pilots, sometimes barely trained. A few Mustang veterans voiced respect for the tenacity of their opponents, noting that even in the final months of the war, many Japanese aviators fought with astonishing skill and bravery. Yet respect could not slow the momentum of the campaign. With each mission, the Japanese fighter presence grew thinner, their attacks more sporadic and desperate. The air over Tokyo became increasingly one-sided, a domain shaped by American aircraft and shadowed by the looming destruction of the bomber raids. By June and July, the air war over Japan had become a symbol of the conflict's broader trajectory, a conflict where endurance, industry, and adaptation had overwhelmed early advantages and tactical brilliance. The Mustangs ranged across the mainland with expanding confidence, sweeping aside the last remnants of resistance. Pilots on both sides sensed the approaching end, though none could predict the exact form it would take. The firebombings had devastated major cities. Naval blockades choked supply lines, and internal communications were frayed nearly to breaking. Japanese pilots who continued to fly did so with a sense of duty so deeply ingrained that even hopeless missions carried meaning. Many later recalled this period with solemn pride, a final stand made with whatever strength remained, under skies illuminated by burning cities and tracer fire. As Japan's defenses continued to crumble, American intelligence reports began documenting the near-total collapse of the Japanese fighter arm. Some squadrons had only a handful of operational aircraft, others had fuel for only a few sorties per week. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep a few fighters aloft, working with tools dulled by years of overuse. Even the elite units that once spearheaded Japan's victories in China and the Pacific were reduced to fragments of their former selves. For the Mustang pilots escorting B-29s deeper and deeper into Japanese airspace, the change was palpable. Fewer intercepts, fewer coordinated attacks, more instances of solitary Japanese fighters making desperate, doomed charges. These encounters carried a new poignancy, a recognition, even amid the violence, of the human cost underlying Japan's final defense. The crescendo of the air war came not with a single battle but with a series of devastating raids that left entire districts of Tokyo flattened into ashes. The Mustangs circled above these infernos, driving off the few fighters that attempted to intervene and ensuring that the B-29s could operate with near impunity. The scale of destruction was beyond anything either side had imagined years earlier. Pilots returning to Iwo Jima after these missions often flew in silence, the images of burning cities imprinted on their minds. For some, the emotional weight of these missions lingered long after the war, prompting difficult reflections about the cost of victory and the line between necessity and devastation. Yet at the time, their duty was clear: end the war as swiftly as possible and end the suffering of those still fighting. And then, suddenly, it ended. The news of the atomic bombs shocked the world, and the Emperor's surrender announcement cast a hush across the airfields of both nations. In Japan, surviving pilots received the news with disbelief, relief, and profound sorrow. Many had expected to die defending their homeland. Now the war was over, and they were left to wrestle with the weight of survival. In America, pilots stationed on Iwo Jima listened quietly as the words of surrender crackled over the radio. They had flown some of the most dangerous missions of the war, seen comrades fall into the sea, and watched the destruction of cities they had never set foot in. The moment of peace felt heavy, almost unreal, a sudden stillness after months of relentless motion. Looking back, the story of the P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo remains one of the defining chapters of the air war in the Pacific. It is a story shaped by innovation, strategy, endurance, and human resilience. It reveals how technological breakthroughs can shift the course of history, but also how the courage of individuals persists even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Japanese pilots who rose to meet the Mustangs fought with extraordinary determination. Despite limitations that would have broken less disciplined air forces, the American pilots who escorted the bombers carried out one of the most complex and demanding missions of the war, pushing their aircraft and themselves to the limits of endurance. Together, their story forms a portrait of a world at a crossroads, a world poised between destruction and renewal as the final months of the war unfolded. And yet, the full story does not end here. There are deeper layers, individual accounts, and post-war reflections that continue to shape our understanding of these events. How did the men who survived those final months carry the memories into the years that followed? What happened to the pilots on both sides when the roaring engines fell silent, when the smoke cleared, and the war they had given everything to simply ended? And what truths emerged only later in memoirs, in interviews, in quiet conversations between former enemies about the shock, awe, and grim respect forged in the skies over Tokyo? These questions mark the beginning of Part 3, where the war itself ends, but the story continues in the lives of the men who fought it. In the days that followed Japan's surrender, the airfields around Tokyo became places of uneasy stillness. Hangars that had once echoed with the metallic clatter of tools and engines now stood in silence, their floors littered with the debris of hurried final operations. Aircraft that had risen again and again to meet the Mustangs sat abandoned on their revetments, some scorched, others scavenged for parts, many simply left where they had last rolled to a stop. Pilots who had once woken each day expecting a final mission now wandered the airstrips without direction, trying to understand what survival meant when the cause they had been prepared to die for no longer existed. Some described an overwhelming emptiness, as though the sky itself had turned its back on them. Others felt relief so profound it left them trembling. And through it all, the memory of those shimmering silver fighters, those Mustangs that had cut across the sky with such certainty, remained etched in their minds like the trails of contrails stretching over a burning city. American pilots experienced a very different but equally profound shift. After months of grinding escort missions from Iwo Jima flights filled with danger, monotony, and the constant awareness of the sea below, the sudden end of combat felt surreal. They walked across the volcanic ash of the island and looked at the Mustangs lined up on the tarmac. Machines now without purpose, their guns silent and their wings still dusted with the residue of salt air. Some pilots felt a deep pride in having survived their missions. Others were haunted by the absence of those who had not. The open ocean had claimed many. Combat had taken others. The victory brought relief, but not always joy. For many American aviators, the end of the war ushered in reflections that would accompany them for the rest of their lives. Reflections on the cost of air dominance, the lives saved and lost, and the sight of cities burning far below their wings. In the quiet hours after VJ Day, men who had faced danger with steady nerves found themselves wrestling with memories they rarely spoke aloud. The occupation brought the two sides into an unexpected form of contact. Japanese pilots, stripped of their weapons and authority, sometimes found themselves face to face with the very Americans they had once attempted to shoot down. These encounters ranged from formal interrogations to brief, awkward exchanges near airfields where the Mustangs now landed peacefully. Some Japanese airmen were astonished by the politeness of the Americans, who showed curiosity rather than contempt. American officers, many of whom respected the tenacity of their former adversaries, treated the defeated pilots with a professionalism shaped by their own military ethos. In these meetings, there was often an unspoken recognition. Both sides had risked their lives in the same unforgiving sky. That shared experience formed a subtle, almost invisible bond, a recognition of the strange fraternity of war, where men who tried to kill each other could still understand each other more deeply than anyone else. In the months after the surrender, American intelligence teams collected a wealth of Japanese materials, documents, logs, pilot reports, and technical manuals. These revealed in stark detail how strained Japan's Air Force had become by 1945. Reports described fuel so impure that it damaged engines within hours, aircraft rolling off assembly lines with manufacturing defects that should never have passed inspection, pilots logging barely enough flight time to feel comfortable in their own cockpits, let alone face elite American flyers. Yet what struck many analysts most was the sheer determination of Japanese aviators, who continued flying despite conditions that would have grounded any Western Air Force. When the Americans interviewed surviving Japanese pilots, they found individuals who spoke with a mix of pride, regret, and weary honesty. Some admitted they had known the war was lost long before the Mustangs arrived, but still felt compelled to fly. Others recalled the shock of seeing the Mustang's speed and climb rate, describing them with language that blended fear with admiration. And some simply spoke of the friends they had lost, names written in logbooks that now felt like memorials. Meanwhile, American pilots returning home found themselves stepping back into a country eager to celebrate victory. Newspapers hailed the Mustang as one of the great triumphs of American engineering. Veterans were greeted as heroes, yet many pilots struggled to articulate what they had truly experienced over Japan. The public saw the Mustang as a symbol of power and precision. The pilots saw something more complicated, a machine that had saved their lives, yes, but also one that had carried them through battles that left lasting scars. Some veterans found it difficult to adjust to civilian life, where the noise of a crowd or the glare of sunlight might trigger memories of combat flights. Others became instructors, passing on their hard-won experience to a new generation. A few, seeking peace, simply walked away from aviation entirely, but all of them carried within them the memory of those long missions over the Pacific. The sight of Japan's coastline rising through the mist, and the haunting knowledge of what war costs on both sides of the ocean. For Japan, the post-war years brought a painful but transformative reckoning. The nation rebuilt its industries, reshaped its government, and eventually emerged as a peaceful economic power. Former pilots found new roles as engineers, factory workers, and businessmen. Some contributed their technical knowledge to Japan's growing aviation industry, which rose with remarkable speed in the decades that followed. A few even met their former American adversaries at post-war reunions, where once hostile veterans shook hands, shared stories, and found surprising common ground. These meetings often revealed a mutual respect that had remained unspoken during the war. American pilots were struck by the humility and candor of their Japanese counterparts. Japanese pilots, in turn, expressed admiration for the skill and courage of the Americans who had flown the Mustangs. In these conversations, one hears echoes of a truth that transcends nations, that those who survive battle often understand each other more deeply than anyone else ever could. Historical research in the decades that followed deepened the understanding of what had unfolded over Japan. Scholars like Richard Overy, John Keegan, and aviation historians such as Roger Freeman documented the technical, strategic, and human dimensions of the air campaign. Their work illuminated how the Mustang's arrival had accelerated Japan's defeat, but also how the psychological impact of the aircraft had reverberated far beyond the immediate battles. Japanese memoirs and oral histories, meanwhile, offered a view from the other side. Accounts of young men pushed into combat with too little training, too little fuel, and too little hope. These writings revealed the profound sense of duty that drove them, the grief of losing comrades, and the shock they felt upon facing the Mustang for the first time. Together, these perspectives created a fuller picture, not merely a story of technological superiority, but of human beings struggling to navigate a war spiraling toward its end. Over time, the P-51 Mustang became more than a fighter plane. It became a symbol. In America, it represented ingenuity, speed, and the turning point in both the European and Pacific air wars. In Japan, it became a reminder of a moment when the world's technological and industrial forces converged in overwhelming fashion. Yet the Mustang's legacy in Japan took on a surprising nuance. As Japan rebuilt its aviation sector, engineers studied the design features that had made the P-51 so effective: its laminar flow wings, its Merlin engine integration, its long-range capabilities. Some saw in the Mustang not a symbol of defeat, but an example of excellence to learn from. In the decades that followed, Japanese aviation firms produced aircraft that carried echoes of the lessons learned from the war, a testament to how nations can transform even the darkest chapters of their history into steps toward renewal. For the pilots themselves, memory was the final battlefield. Some Japanese veterans spoke openly about their wartime experiences. Others remained silent for decades. Some American veterans attended reunions and shared stories with former comrades. Others kept their memories locked away, the sound of a Merlin engine forever tied to moments they could not fully revisit. But among those who did speak, a common theme emerged: the sense that the air war had shaped them for life, marking them with both pride and sorrow. They remembered the roar of engines and the sudden flash of tracer fire, the beauty of a sunrise seen from 20,000 feet, the terror of watching an enemy aircraft break apart mid-air, the stillness that followed a long mission's end. And they remembered the men on the other side, unseen faces inside aircraft whose silhouettes became as familiar as one's own reflection. Today, when historians talk about the air war over Japan, they often focus on strategy, technology, or the staggering scale of destruction. But beneath all of that lies a deeper story, one of human endurance, of courage under impossible conditions, and of the quiet connections that outlive the wars that forged them. The P-51 Mustangs that once shocked Japanese pilots over Tokyo now exist mostly in museums, airshows, and the memories of the few veterans still alive. Their engines start with a cough of smoke, their wings gleam under polished light, and for a moment, the past rises again. Visitors stand beside them and imagine what it must have been like to face such machines or to fly them. And in that moment, even briefly, the echoes of 1945 feel close enough to touch. The story of the P-51s over Tokyo is not merely a tale of victory or defeat. It is a story of transformation, of nations, of technologies, and of the men whose lives were shaped in the crucible of war. It is a reminder that history is not just events, but the experiences of individuals caught within them. And it is a testament to how, even in the aftermath of destruction, understanding can emerge across former battle lines, carried by those who lived through the same storms on opposite sides of the sky.
If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.